Drug shortages are costing hospitals at least $360 million annually in labor costs alone. The United States healthcare system is a for-profit system. What all of these pieces put together are pointing to is a market failure.
I want to jump into a super important segment with AOC taking down MAGA in Congress, discussing drug shortages and their unwillingness to address them, largely because they want to enrich in their donors, something I think that sets a good stage to speak about Big Pharma and how MAGA will always be controlled by them. So leave us a like on the video if you can. It lets us know you enjoy the content. It gives us a big bump in the algorithm, and let's hop right into the discussion.
When these kids and their parents show up at a hospital and they're unable to breathe, they may not be able to access the medicine that they need if there is a shortage. Ms. O'Connell, can you help the general public understand why is it that in such a common condition such as asthma and with such a broadly available drug like albuterol, how can we get to a place and how do we get to a place where there's a shortage of it in the United States?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Albuterol wasn't one of the issues that we dealt with directly in ASPR, but observationally, I think it's a perfect example, as you've laid out, of the fragility of the generics market. Albuterol is a generic drug. There had two manufacturers in the United States. One of them declared bankruptcy and left the market. That left a shortage. And there have been very few incentives, as have been discussed already at the table, to encourage generic manufacturing of albuterol in the country.
And this is directly because of Big Pharma and the profit motive, but quickly, it's why it's frustrating that Trump and MAGA are trying to co-opt this leftist language and rhetoric, because they don't really understand it or the problem, and they can't critically engage with it. And it leads them to saying, well, incredibly stupid things like Big Pharma is responsible for vaccines, because they'd rather just spew nonsense than do the least bit of research and all of this other crazy stuff to, like, justify their insane conspiracies. But the problem is generic drugs are less profitable, so private investment doesn't want to touch them. That's a flaw with capitalism. An even more complex problem there is that the research that goes into the creation of these are even less profitable, and they're even more drawn out in terms of if you would or when you will ever see profit, especially, I mean, again, in the short term, you're going to lose a lot of money, and that's why it's even more ignored by private investment. So as Trump is defunding public medical research, defunding research at public institutions, and moving us more into privatized healthcare, it creates this very problem that a single-payer healthcare, universal healthcare system would instantly fix.
There's a lot of talk about incentives, but at the end of the day, the United States healthcare system is a for-profit system. And largely, an incentive is about if making it is profitable. And in a for-profit system, manufacturers need to know that their drugs will be profitable. If it's not profitable, the incentive doesn't exist, it becomes difficult to manufacture. But if manufacturers can't afford to operate, they will leave the market altogether, as you noted, or move their operations abroad. Meanwhile, drug shortages are costing hospitals at least $360 million annually in labor costs alone for making up for some of these shortages. And so what all of these pieces put together are pointing to is a market failure. And ironically, this market failure is emerging because the drug is affordable.
She is exactly right. And this is a conversation that most capitalists just won't have, because they have to pretend that capitalism is perfect in every way, or if something's wrong, it's the Democrats, of course, not capitalism. But free markets typically fail at the distribution of necessities. We see this in medicine and housing and food. I mean, we see this in every sector. And in medicine, we see it mixed with another huge flaw in a for-profit capitalist type system, that if something is beneficial for the majority of people, but it cannot be made for less than it can be sold for, then it'll never be made in capitalism. In medicine, a good real-life example of this is cancer research. Because of the lack of profit in treatments that aren't cures, and how far we are away from a potential cure and, return on investment in research towards it, the private sector largely just ignores this. I mean, we see this play out as the NIH funds cancer research to the tune of $7 billion a year. It's the world leader. Meanwhile, that number is only tens of millions of dollars through the private sector.
Albuterol is manufactured in the United States, IV fluid manufactured in the United States. Even a couple of years ago, baby formula, also produced in the United States. All three of those things are produced in the United States. All three have had chronic shortages. Ms. O'Connell, could the federal government play a role in manufacturing some of these drugs where we are seeing persistent market failures? And I'm interested in some of your thoughts to that point.
Well, this is a question that we always come back to. Should the government be responsible for the manufacture of, say, vaccines? That was a question we asked ourselves during COVID. And what it comes down to is a commitment from the government to fund both the capacity for the government to do the manufacturing as well as the capability for the government to do that manufacturing. And over the course of our analysis and looking into this, and over many generations of others in similar situations needing to answer that question, what's needed most is a sustained commitment.
I think this point blends really well with showing the flaws in Trump's tariff plan and why it's really dumb and how the idea of producing everything in America is silly and economically illiterate. We just don't have the supply chain infrastructure in most sectors to do so. The problem here is that economics has largely become political as rich people, of course, throw their money behind conservatives to stay in their pockets and dictate policies that will always benefit them over the middle and low class. We're looking at even economics through a political lens, right? Where the fear here is that any admission of market failure gives way to communism, right? And they're scared shitless of not being able to exploit labor anymore. And that hinders us from having the economically literate conversation of just seeing and through observationally, that markets fail at the distribution of necessities. We clearly need to safeguard from market failure when we're talking about medicine, right? Like, why is this even a question? Why is preserving the profit vehicle more important than preserving the health of Americans to MAGA? It's kind of sickening at that point, isn't it?